Yo, what up folks, TCG here with my Explorer and Pioneer set review for Phyrexia All Will Be One. The set pre-releases this weekend and then comes out on Arena the day after. I'm super excited to get my hands on the cards. Obviously it's a big set, there's a lot to go through, and I've kind of curated a bit of a list, so if there's a card you think I've missed or that you'd like my opinion on, please do let me know in the comments. I have a ton of Explorer and Pioneer content planned over the next few weeks, and so do subscribe to the channel for that kind of content. Other than that, let's get into the set review. Kicking it off with the white cards, we have Against All Odds, a pretty innocuous 4-mana spell, and two abilities that are okay by themselves, but together might prove quite potent. Choose one or both, exile target artifact or creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. Return target artifact or creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. And so, sure, both these abilities are kind of fine by themselves, but together the ability that, okay, I'm going to flicker something and bring something back, makes it a good card when you're both committed to the board, and also when you're recovering. And obviously, triggering into the battlefield abilities is very powerful. You've got things like Reflector Mage, Galactic Apparition, all kinds of stuff. And so, despite this being a sorcery speed, I think this is the card that is kind of like a, kind of a sleeper pick. Next up, much less of a sleeper pick, Elesh Norn, Mother of the Machines, kind of the flagship card of the set. 4 and a white, legendary creature, Vigilance for 7. If a permanent entering the battlefield causes triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time, and permanents entering the battlefield don't cause abilities of permanents to your opponent's control to trigger. Now there's a lot here, but it's fairly straightforward. You turn all your opponents and the battlefield effects off, and you get to do all yours twice. And so Elesh Norn is pretty nuts, and a 4/7 body to boot, super hard to remove. The only issue is getting into play. There are decks like Enigmatic Incarnation, which will love Elesh Norn. They have all these enchantment effects and creatures who enter the battlefield abilities, and you get to absolutely go off. And there are a bunch of other homes I feel like it could pop up as well. It's just a super powerful card. Next up, the Eternal Wanderer, 6-mana Planeswalker. Okay, bit of a reach here. Like, hey, not a ton of those that see play in Pioneer and Explorer, but no more than one creature can attack the Eternal Wanderer each combat. Very important ability to help protect itself. +1, exile up to 1 target artifact or creature, return it to the battlefield under its own control at the beginning of the next player's end step, and then 0, make a 2/2 Samurai with double strike, -4, for each player choose a creature that player controls, each player sacrifices all creatures they control, not chosen this way. And it comes in on 5, so already pretty hard to attack down. Again, it protects itself with its ability to only attack it with one creature, and then you can immediately use that Divine Reckoning style ability. I think that's the each player chooses a creature and sacrifices the rest. Straight away. And so it's pretty powerful, and these C2s have double striking here in the game pretty quickly. It's a bit of a narrow one, but I think it has potential to see some play. The one thing going against it really is that we already have so many good things to do in blue and white, and maybe it pops up into something like black-white, but there's also another tool for that in the set. And so we'll see how things go. If there's a Planeswalker deck floating around, it might fit in here, even if it doesn't necessarily make it into something like blue-white control. Next up, Kemba Ka Enduring. If you've been watching this channel for a little bit, you might know that I've been really looking into Hammer recently, both in Pioneer and Explorer. It's obviously a staple of the modern format, but Kemba Ka Enduring does add another tool to Pioneer and Explorer for it. 1 and a white, legendary cat cleric, 2/2, whenever Kemba Ka Enduring or another cat enters the battlefield in your control, attach up to 1 target equipment you control to that creature. And then equipped creatures you control get +1/+1. And that actually does affect itself. And so, obviously, the idea is you play Hammer on turn 1, this on turn 2, it picks up the Hammer. All of a sudden you have a 13/13. And so it's just another way to get the Hammer equipped, which is obviously the main kind of problem the deck struggles with. In Pioneer, we also have Sigarda's Aid. In Explorer, we're yet to have that, but hopefully Sigarda's Aid will be on Arena when Shadows of Innistrad Remastered comes out. It's a big boon for the deck regardless in both formats. Really good. Looking forward to playing with it. I've already ordered some copies. Next up, we have Ossification. And this is another kind of innocuous card. 1 and a white, enchant basic land you control. When it enters the battlefield, exile target creature or planeswalker opponent controls until Ossification leaves the battlefield. In Explorer, we don't have Chain to the Rocks. In Pioneer, we do, but this also says Planeswalker, which is a bit of an upgrade despite it costing more mana. It's just a pretty efficient removal spell. Enchanting basic lands means, hey, you're not going to worry about getting your, Sacred Foundry, Field of Ruin, or something like that. And so, sometimes that's a downside, because obviously you need to be playing basics, but can be a nice boon to some decks. Phyrexia Vindicator is another one that's kind of like on the fringe of playability. White, flying, which is a big thing to actually remember, because it is a 5/5, and will, even without the ability, be a big flying threat. If damage would be dealt to Phyrexian Vindicator, prevent that damage. Alright, and when damage is prevented this way, Phyrexia Vindicator deals that much damage to any other target. Kind of like a Boris Reckoner style thing. There are some ways you can try and abuse this. One of the things we did have way back when was like Blasphemous Act, but that's unfortunately not in either Explorer or Pioneer. But there are some other things you can do, and you can find ways to abuse it. The real trick is that it's a 4-mana creature that doesn't have an Enter the Battlefield ability to kind of impact the board straight away. Though, hey, and the thing to remember about these quad cost cards is that they also do tremendous things to your devotion, even if it's a little awkward to have a bunch of Nicholas in your deck when trying to cast white. Phyrexia Vindicator has a lot of potential, is like strong by itself, but again, there's a limit to what you can get away with for 4 mana at sorcery speed without impacting the board straight away. No Obliterators, Haters, Persecutors, Slow, Hero, Bladehold, I don't think so, etc, etc, etc. Plated Onslaught is another kind of hedge here. It has affinity for artifacts, which is super important, but 3 white has that affinity for artifacts, and it's an instant as well. Creatures you control get +2/+1 turn to turn. We do have some white artifact-based aggro decks. Power up your Ornithopters and your Ginger Brutes and all that stuff. Some of those decks play like red, do things with Bomat Courier, but I think there's enough tools for a solid white like artifact aggro deck. And so here we are. Sort of along that line, but also sort of not. Skrelv, Defector Blight. White for a 1/1 legendary artifact creature. Phyrexia Might. Toxic 1. Alright. Which is the first toxic card on this list as well. Players dealt combat damage by his creature also gain a poison counter. We'll talk a bit more about that going on later. Can't block, but Phyrexian White, choose a colour. Another target creature you control gets Toxic 1 and Hexproof from that colour until end of turn. And then it can't be blocked by creatures of that colour this turn. There's a lot going on here, there's a lot to unpack. Firstly, it's legendary. You can't like play a bunch of these in play and kind of protect each other. That's off the table. Toxic 1, for the time being, I wouldn't read too much into that, because obviously it does regular damage as well, and the effect's quite powerful. So regardless of whether there's a good Toxic deck in the format, I think this card could be very, very good. And then the last thing is that ability there, you're not paying mana necessarily, obviously you can pay that 2 life, but that racks up pretty quickly. Choose a colour, and then another target creature, so it can't protect itself, and again, you can't have multiples in play to like have one protect the other. But Toxic 1 and Hexproof, rather than protection, it can't be blocked by creatures of that colour. And so there's a bunch of important keywords here. The card is pretty powerful, especially if you're trying to do some kind of degenerate combo and want a way to protect it. I love creature combo. And then the last white card to talk about here is White Sun's Twilight. X white, you gain X life, create X 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might artifact creature tokens with Toxic 1. They're Might artifact tokens. I'm not going to read it each time. If X is 5 or more, destroy all the creatures. Kind of like a martial coup. White X, make some creatures, destroy the rest of them. Pretty powerful. The nice thing about these kind of effects is that you can play them out of like mid-range decks, and you can just use them to put a bunch of tokens out. If you're playing against like mid-range mirrors, or you're playing against like control, or hey, if you're behind that mid-range mirror on the board, you can be like, alright, I'm going to reset the board, but I also end up with a bunch of creatures. And so, has a lot of potential there, has a lot of potential. Let's hop into blue with Blue Sun's Twilight. X blue, gain control of target creature with mana value X or less. If X is 5 or more, create a token that's a copy of that creature. So I actually put Entrancing Melody, the blue X, just without that last ability, into some decks quite recently. And I think I thought that had some potential to be quite good in the format as a sideboard card. With this bonus ability, where that X is 5 or more, create a copy, I think it is really, really powerful. There are decks where there are some nice things to steal, even better to get more of them. And though I think Blue Sun's Twilight is quite good, though probably more of a sideboard card than a main deck card. Bring the Ending. Okay, so Infect matters stuff. Sorry, Poison counters matters. So on the face of it, this is a 2-mana counter spell. Just 1 and a blue, counter target spell unless it's controlled base 2. Already, you know, okay, kind of interesting. It's caught your eye. But then it has this counter that spell instead if it's a controller that has 3 or more poison counters. And so there is the potential, and there's a lot of cards with this kind of effect stapled on, either to kind of, hey, give your opponent's a counter, or with a bonus. And it all depends really, I think, on how much you get out of it. If there are enough payoff cards to both distribute counters in those colours and then get them without actually sacrificing like card quality with the ability not in play, I think that there might be a solid shell there. But that remains to be seen. I'm definitely going to test with it. We'll see how it goes, but absolutely on my list of cards I'm interested in. And also on that list is Distorted Curiosity, 2 and a blue. This spell costs 2 or less to cast if an opponent has 3 or more poison counters. Draw 2 cards. And I should also say at this point that while I'm saying like, oh, if there's enough things to spread poison counters around, I'm not entirely convinced yet that there's going to be like a in-effect style poison deck. Obviously you can only get 1 counter at a time, and that is a huge nerf to kind of regulate impact creatures that we see. And from what I've seen, I'm not convinced that there's going to be like alright, we're just going to stack enough copies of Toxic onto this creature to make it work. And so I think the more kind of spell-based poison decks might do a bit better. But we'll see. Absolutely going to try both. Next up, Encroaching Mycosynth. And this is kind of like a Mycosynth Lattice style effect. 3 and a blue non-land permanents you control are artifacts in addition to the other types. Same is true for permanents you control and non-land permanents you control are on the battlefield. This is an expensive effect, again, 4 mana artifact. You can 2 for it with Karn, which is sweet, but if you have enough things that care about you having a ton of artifacts, or cards that let you play artifacts, or cards that let you like tutor for artifacts, or cheaper for artifacts, all that kind of stuff, then hey, maybe there's a deck out there for Encroaching Mycosynth. Next up, Experimental Augury. I talked before a little bit about how if there's enough cards that are decent by themselves, but have this upside, then hey, maybe there's something to be had here. And this is Anticipate, so look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one into your hand, the rest on the bottom of your library in any order, put one in a blue, but with this Proliferate stapled on. And so even if you're not necessarily doing poison things, trying to like, you know, tick up your opponent's poison counters over time, still works really, really well with a bunch of Planeswalkers. Maybe you want to get a couple of extra draws out of your Narset. Maybe you want to, like, there's a ton of uses, there's a bunch of use cases, both in kind of control and in, like, more tempo or combo-based strategies, and so I think this card is one of the better cards. Ikamoon Gauntlet, 2 and a blue. Artifact, Planeswalkers you control have 0 Proliferate and -12 take an extra turn after this one. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put a counter on target permanent. Put an additional counter of that kind on that permanent. The potential of this card is pretty nuts. Obviously, again, 3 mana artifact, you have to tap out and play it, it's vulnerable, sure, but the payoff could be pretty huge. I've talked a little bit about different extra turns decks, which, hey, that's an ultimate ability, but those decks would like things to do with those extra turns, and one of the best things to do when you're taking extra turns is activate Planeswalkers, and if those Planeswalkers get to tick up really, really quickly, and then you have a bunch of interaction that you can play that also puts counters on those permanents and things, hey, you can go off to the races pretty quick. And kind of in that range, we also have Jace, the Perfected Mind. Our first completed Planeswalker comes in with 5 counters, or bear in mind, please, 2 less for each Phyrexia mana you pay. So in this case, you can pay it for 3, in which case it comes in with 3 counters, and then +1 until your next turn, up to 1 target creature gets -3/-0, has that kind of ability to protect itself. It's coming down on turn 3, so there won't be that many creatures in play, so you can very well survive wasted turn just with playing and ticking it up, even versus something quite aggressive. -2, target player mills 3 cards, then if a creature has then if a graveyard has 20 or more cards in it, you draw 3 cards, otherwise you draw a card. And then -X, target player mills 3 times X cards. So this is an interesting one. Both is like oh hey, kind of neat mill card, but also I've been messing around with Dredge, and the ability to mill yourself is actually pretty nuts here. Especially when you have this absolutely insane payoff of being like, hey, I'll mill some, and then eventually I'll get to draw a bunch of cards. And then also, 3 mana comes in on 3 for 2 life. And then you can immediately -3 to mill 9. Explorer doesn't have Breaking and Entering yet, and so 3 mana mill yourself a 9 is actually pretty good as things go, even if it's a little higher on the mana curve than you'd like. So shout outs to Jace. Mercurial Spelldancer is it's got a lot of text, 1 and a blue for a 2/1, Phyrexian Rogue, can't be blocked. Already kind of interesting. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put an oil counter on it. Okay, more oil counter stuff. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you may reveal 2 oil counters, and then if you do, when you cast your next instant or sorcery spell, copy it. And you can choose new targets for the copy. Free stuff's cool. 2 mana 2/1 is vulnerable to a lot of removal. Can't be blocked, which is obviously a huge upside. Hey, if you get to untap with it, you can really, really go off. But there are quite a lot of good 2-drops for something like blue-red. We'll see. Mind Splice Apparatus. 3 and a blue, flash, which is super, super important here. Artifact. At the beginning of your upkeep, put an oil counter on it. Instant sorceries you cast cost 1 less to cast for each oil counter on Mind Splice Apparatus. Now, I talked about extra turns. We don't have part of the Water Veil in Explorer, but we do have Auron's Epiphany and some other potential cards you could use. This having flash is kind of like the massive upside to it. You get to play your draw go style control stuff the first few turns. Turn 4 you get to flash this in, beginning of your upkeep, put a counter on it, and all of a sudden everything gets cheaper and then continues to get cheaper for the rest of the game. That is super, super powerful. Super. I can't understate how powerful that is. But the downside is that you need to put this 4 mana artifact into play. And I've talked about how that's normally bad, but here in this case, at least it's flash, you can at least do it on your opponent's turn, and then immediately untap and start getting the rewards from it. And so, another one I really want to mess around with. Minor Misstep is a card that had a lot of hype or a lot of interest in it. Blue, counter target spell with mana value 1 or less. Really, I think this is better in older formats. Looking at Modern, looking at Legacy, I still don't know exactly if it'll break through into play here. But for Pioneer and for Explorer, I don't love it. Decks in Explorer and Pioneer tend to go way up higher on the mana curve than decks in Modern Legacy. And there'll be so many times when Minor Misstep is bad, and for that reason, I'm not out, but I'm like, it's interesting, but I'm not convinced. Prologue to Phyrexia is the next card on the list here, and this simply says, each opponent gets a poison counter, draw a card. Again, I mentioned, like, hey, if you have some kind of quote-unquote free ways where you're not really sacrificing card quality to give your opponent poison counters, maybe there's something there. And so most of these kind of, like, effects that get the bonuses need 3 poison counters, but you can also field deck with things that proliferate. Prologue to Phyrexia is one of the best ways to give your opponent a poison counter in a deck that's not playing, like, creatures with Toxic. The best, it cantrips as well, not that much of a downside, and so you just get to go on turn 2, alright, I'll do this, draw my card on the end of your turn, you get a poison counter, and all of a sudden, we're off to the races. The real question is if there's another effect to get the poison counter on there that is good and playable, because I think you probably need 2, and if there's enough effects like that that are also just, like, reasonable to have, like here it cantrips, you're like, okay, but you don't want to be sacrificing spell efficiency. Next up, Reject Imperfection. 1 blue, counter target spell. If that spell, the mana value was 3 or less, proliferate. Yeah, nothing else to really say here. It's a counter spell with proliferate on it. We have a bunch of different 3 mana counter spells. They're not all that great. Absorb, obviously, gain 3 life. You have, in Pioneer, you have Void Shatter, which is immune to things like Mystical Dispute, like pseudo-immune, like obviously they can just pay 3. In Exploring, you have the Surveil counter spell. There's a couple of other options as well, so hey. Serum Snare, 1 blue, return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. I like an Echoing Truth. If that permanent had a mana value 3 or less, proliferate. And so yeah, there's a few different effects which are like, hey, this is interesting. We're gonna give you the opportunity to proliferate a bit. It's alright, it's there. Tekuthal Inquiry Dominus, 2 blue, legendary creature Phyrexian Horror. Flying, if you proliferate twice instead, and then 1 Phyrexian blue, remove 3 counters from among other artifacts, creatures, and players you control to put an indestructible counter on it. I didn't talk about the white one of these, but I thought I'd talk about this one. The double proliferate effect is nuts, even for 4 mana, and the idea is that you'd be probably not playing this on curve, you'd be playing this later in the game and then immediately doing some things to kind of abuse it. The ability to give Indestructible here, because it uses Phyrexia mana, is also pretty cheap to activate, and obviously if you've got things that you've proliferate onto already, or with counters on, then you can activate that straight away, kind of make it immune to some of the removal. Obviously there's a bunch of stuff that exiles as well, which is I think why this kind of cycle of legendary creatures isn't as strong as it maybe seems on the surface. It's pretty interesting. Annoyed with Affliction, 1 black, exile target creature if it has value 3 or less. Exile that creature instead if its controller has 3 or more poison counters. So potentially like a super efficient removal spell versus everything, but on the face of it, a very good removal spell versus like cheap creatures. Obviously we have things like Fatal Push, Cut Down, a plethora of 2 mana removal spells, some of which we'll even get more of later in this set. Hey, it's interesting. And again, if you have enough ways to put poison counters on, it becomes like the most efficient removal spell in the format, nearly. Black Sun's Twilight, X and a black, up to 1 target creature gets -X turn to turn, and if X is 5 or more, return a creature card with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Not a super efficient removal spell, but an okay removal spell. You really be playing it if you have things you want to reanimate, whether that be out of the sideboard in some kind of like mid-range mirror, but the fact that it doesn't like... Creatures aren't typically what these mirrors are about anymore. You could pay 6 mana to kill Sheoldred, bring yours back from the graveyard. There's a potential there, and so it's the kind of card I maybe see as like a one-of in something. Drivnod, Carnage of Dominus, and I apologise if I just butcher these card names as well. 3 black, legendary creature, Phyrexian Horror. If a creature dying causes the triggered ability of an permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. Black, Phyrexia mana, exile 3 cards from your graveyard, put a destructible counter on it. There are 2 big things here, I think. Firstly, Dye's effects. We have a ton of those. I've played a bunch of both Citadel and like Aristocrat style decks. But one of the kind of cool things I think is kind of under the radar here is that you can activate this ability with no actual mana. You can just pay 4 life, exile 3 creatures, and put a counter on it, and it's worth saying that these abilities are not sorcery speed. And so you can do that whenever. And so despite it being an 8-3 with a relatively low toughness, I think Drivnod actually stands a bit of a shot. Drown in Ichor. 1 black, target creature gets -4/-4 until end of turn, proliferate. This is a really strong removal spell. It is sorcery speed, bear that in mind, don't let it trick you, but it does have the proliferate tag on it. Again, something like blue-black control maybe, you're like, okay, I've got enough effects now over the 2 colours that I just want to play into this proliferate mechanic and try and just take my opponent up to 10 poison counters, I'm definitely going to try it. Very cool. Infectious Inquiry. Speaking of, 2 and a black, you draw 2 cards and you lose 2 life. Each opponent gets a poison counter. And this is kind of like on the verge, right? You don't really want to be tapping out on turn 3 in your control deck. So if this ability to give your opponent a poison counter, because like they draw 2 cards, lose 2 life, like okay, it's like a bad read, the bone, sign and blood, like fine. But how reliable, how many pieces are there for this deck? Do you need to play this? And what's the kind of punishment on the back end of like, okay, I'm going to tap out for this card to give you a poison counter. Maybe you play a couple of these and just plan to do it on like turn 7. But hey, interesting. Phyrexian Arena. This is like obviously like a home run as far as like cards go. It's seen play in Modern. It's seen play in other formats. Something like Black Devotion, where you can get like a cool permanent to put into play to add to your Devotion that gives you advantage over time, but then also isn't vulnerable to removal. Very, very important there. In some sideboards, maybe potentially have something like Black Red, where you're just like in the mirror, you're just going to run out of cards. We're both going to end up playing off the top deck at some point. And so, hey, Phyrexian Arena, super cool. Phyrexian Obliterator. Yes. Black, 5/5 trample. Whenever a source deals damage to Phyrexian Obliterator, that source's controller sacrifices that many permanents. The real test. Again, the Obliterator test is a thing. Like, look, it's a 4-mana creature that you're going to play onto the battlefield, and then maybe your opponent kills you. Or maybe your opponent's just like, okay, cool, censor. And so that's the downside of the card, but obviously the upside is fairly clear. It's a nuts creature to have in play, it's really, really hard to deal with, and it adds a bunch of devotion. 3 pretty great things. I'll keep going. Sheoldred's Edict. Oh yeah, there's a ton of good black removal spots in the set. 1 in the black, each opponent sacrifices a non-token creature. Each opponent sacrifices a creature token. Each opponent sacrifices a planeswalker. I understand, but would rather some of the times when they print these kinds of effects nowadays, they all seem to say each opponent, whether that be like Liliana's Verdict or whatever, or like this. And sometimes you're like, I would like to be able to like Liliana's Sanctity as like a reasonable response to these kind of effects. But it is pretty good. We don't have a ton of edicts that see play in the format, and so interesting. Vat of Rebirth. Black for an artifact. Whenever another artifact or creature you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, it gets an oil counter. And then 3 tap, remove foil oil counters, return target creature from your graveyard to the battlefield as it owns the sorcery. And you might think, well, this is an odd one to choose. But again, talking about like aristocrats and stuff, or even like the thing that actually solves me on this card is that this does not sacrifice. This ability doesn't sacrifice, it gets to stay in play, it gets to get more oil counters, and the ability always costs 3 mana to activate, and then remove foil oil counters. And so you can actually, and there's no limitation, like you can get whatever creature you want back. It doesn't have to be like CMC3 or less, and so I'd keep an eye on Vat of Rebirth. Fran, Executioner Thane, 1 in a black legendary creature, Phyrexian Vampire. Whenever 1 or more other creatures you control dies, each opponent loses 2 life, and you gain 2 life. Triggers once a turn. That's a 2/2. Again, I've been playing some sacrifice stuff recently. It's a nice effect to go along with. Obviously, it's not contributing necessarily to your, okay, I'm just going to like kill you in a turn plan. But when you're like, okay, I'd like to like sacrifice this goat token, the Scry, hey, gain 2 life, lose 2 life, make the game a bit easier for yourself, and then, hey, yeah. So I think it's the kind of card I play like a copy of, maybe 2 copies of. Vraska Betrayal Sting. 4 black, Phyrexian black. 6 mana total, sometimes 5 mana. The reason I put this here is because it's a Planeswalker, it just says, draw a card, proliferate. And then do that repeatedly on a stick. And so, in some kind of like mid-range deck, I think this could be pretty decent. Blue-black mid-range, like a poison counter deck. Trying to win with proliferating stuff. Which I think maybe where I'm going to start brewing. Vraska's 4 here. Each opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker and gets a poison counter. Another effect to distribute poison counters. You're only really doing this if you're interested in getting the poison counter on your opponent. So, hey, we got that floating around. Cacophony Scamp! Into the red cards here. Red for a Phyrexian Goblin Warrior. When Cacophony Scamp deals combat damage to a player, you may sacrifice it. If you do, proliferate. Okay, neat. But when it dies, it deals damage equals its power to any target, and it's a 1/1. And it has the Warrior creature type, which means you can like Resolute Strike onto it and give it a Colossus Hammer. Interesting. Very interesting. And so this actually enables a turn 2 kill with Hammer. You play this on turn 1, and then turn 2 you play Hammer and equip it with Resolute Strike, and then it attacks for 11, and then it sacrifices itself to do 11. Capricious Hellraiser is maybe an interesting one. Maybe you're not expecting to see it on this list. 3 red. Phyrexian Dragon, 4/4 flying. Spell costs 3 less to cast if you have 9 or more cards in your graveyard. Ooh, I wonder where this is going. When Capricious Hellraiser enters the battlefield, exile 3 cards at random from your graveyard, and then choose a non-creature, non-land card from among them and copy it. You can cast the copy without paying its mana cost. There's a bunch of variants ticked into this card here, but I'm basically looking into, alright, how can we butcher our Dredge mana base to get like to play this like 3 mana 4/4 and then potentially reuse one of our like graveyard cards. And maybe sometimes it'll be like a Creeping Chill that you've had to discard to a Haunted Dead. Sometimes it might be something like a Sovereign Spite. Again, you can absolutely butcher your mana base now. You've got Mana Confluence if you want to try and enable this kind of stuff. Maybe it's just a mill spell, and that's totally fine too. And hey, a 4/4 flyer is a very reasonable body to help finish your opponent out in that kind of deck. Interesting. Gleeful Demolition. Red, destroy target artifact. If you control the artifact, create 3 1/1 red goblin creature tokens. Ooh, I do love a good Cold Oath of Rebirth. I really want to mess around with this. And so we'll see. There's some artifacts there are some very cheap ways to get things like blood or other artifacts into play in red, especially. And so enough effects I want to take advantage of that. Ooh, we're cooking. Koth, Fire Resistance. 2 red, Legendary Planeswalker Koth. Search your library for a basic mountain card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. -3, Koth, Fire Resistance deals damage to target creature equals the number of mountains you control. Okay. You get an emblem with whenever it goes out and enters the battlefield under your control, it does 4 damage to any target. So you get a better Valakut. Sweet. 4 mana, comes in on 4, immediately you can tick up to get a mountain, or immediately -3, has that kind of like Challenger Torture Defiance ability basically to deal damage to the number of mountains you control. I love big reds, and so maybe Koth gets there, but it's a super powerful Planeswalker. Is not going to show up by any means in a lot of places, but hey, I think there's a home for it in Explorer and Pioneer. Rebel Salvo, 2 and a red, affinity for equipment. Oh, hype. 5 damage to target creature or Planeswalker. That permanent loses indestructible end of the turn. It's all about like, alright, if I'm playing something like Hammer, how many equipment do I have? How many equipment do I need in play to make this worth it? 3 mana for 5 damage to creature or Planeswalker. Already kind of interested. That kills Sholdred already. 3 mana to kill Sholdred? Alright, 3 mana to kill Teferi? Alright, what if I have an equipment in play? Well, 2 mana. Okay, like there's a lot of things very efficiently. And then obviously if you have 2 equipment lying around, whew. So hey, Rebel Salvo. Volt Charge, an old classic favourite. It used to be like, alright, I'm going to play this plus Koth, I'm going to cast this to put a counter on Koth, and then I'm going to ultimate Koth the next turn. That used to be the quote-unquote combo in like standard block constructed. Again, enough good proliferate effects, and we got a deck on our hands. And so 3 mana for 3 damage isn't super efficient. It is any target. Okay, cool, nice. But hey, it's another proliferate effect to keep an eye on. Into green now with Armored Scrapgorger. 1 and a green for an 0/3. Gets +3/+0 as long as it has 3 or more oil counters on it. Okay, fair enough. Tap add 1 mana of any colour, and then when it becomes tapped, exile target card from a graveyard and put an oil counter on Armored Scrapgorger. And so this is a mana creature. Decent. It's a mana creature that turns into like a reasonable creature, becomes a 3/3 eventually. But importantly, it's a mana creature that also provides graveyard hate. And so hey, alright, Bloated Contaminator, 2 and a green for a 4/4 with trample, toxic 1, and then whenever it deals combat damage to the player, perforate. And so you have this kind of undercosted creature, 3 mana for a 4/4 with trample. It has toxic, and then it also has a way to proliferate the counters. But in like the ideal world, you're just kind of killing them with the 4 damage anyway. So it's a card that's kind of a bit conflicting in itself, but if there is a beat down poison strategy, then I think Bloated Contaminator is like the card to kind of play around and work around here. Cankerbloom. 1 and a green for a 3/2 Phyrexian Fungus, and then it has 1 sacrifice it for a bunch of different abilities. You can either destroy an artifact, okay, destroy an enchantment, okay, yeah, still on board for these things, or proliferate. And so it's a fairly aggressively priced creature with it's a 2 mana 3/2. We get these now, like they used to be a bit more rare, but then it has this other ability, and while it doesn't have a relevant creature type, which is often what makes this style of cards, and we've seen like goblins have some stuff like this. But hey, the versatility is there, and so thought I'd give it a shout out. Conduit of Worlds. 2 green, you may play land cards from your graveyard. It's an artifact that sits in play, but then tap, choose target non-land permanent card in your graveyard. If you haven't cast a spell this turn, you may cast that card. If you do, you can't cast additional spells this turn. Activate as a sorcery. This is all dependent on how much you can get out of that tap ability. We have a few different things with like Ramnap Excavator to let us play lands from our graveyard. We've got things like Splendid Reclamation to get them back. But hey, one of the things that happens with these kind of decks is that you eventually run out of actual cards, and then if you can recast them from your graveyard, that's a bit of a bonus. And so while it's expensive for 4 mana, maybe it comes in as like a 1. Green Sun's Twilight. X and a green. Reveal the top X+1 cards of your library. Choose a creature card and or a land card from among them. Put those cards into your hand and the rest of the bottom in any order. If you pay 5 or more for X, instead put the chosen cards onto the battlefield or into your hand. And obviously that's where this card scales really, really well. Eventually you're just like, alright, look at the top like 5, 6 or whatever, grab a creature and a land, put them into play. Oh, we're off to the races. Nissa Ascendant Alchemist. Okay, so this is like here for particularly one reason. It's 7 mana, or 5 mana and 4 life. And obviously if you pay the 4 life, it comes in on 3 counters. If you pay the 7 mana, it comes in on 7. It's -2 for each Phyrexia mana you decide to play. So don't get fooled, it's not going to be 5 mana make a 7/7 or 8/8 immediately. But the real reason you play this is to have a recursive way to destroy artifacts and enchantments, and just be like, alright, I'm going to play it for 5 or whatever. Or if you're playing green or some ramp deck, maybe you play for 7, and just go, every turn, I'm going to blow up this artifact or enchantment. Blow up this artifact or enchantment. So there's a big, if there's like a deck where this is like super relevant, something like, even in like against mono green now, there are a bunch of artifacts or enchantments you might want to kill in the mirror. Especially, obviously, Karn sideboards, everyone's least favorite card. No, what am I kidding? Least favorite, everybody. Hey, repeatable ways to kill artifacts and enchantments are nice, and normally you see Planeswalkers tick down to quite low loyalty to activate this ability to not be able to activate them multiple times. -1 is super, super cheap. And then you have this ultimate ability here, until end of turn, creatures you control get +1/+1 for each forest you control, and gain trample. And so you have the overrun kind of style thing going on too. So hey, might be around. Rust Vine Cultivator. Green, tap, put an oil counter on it. Tap, remove an oil counter from it, untap target land. Untap target land is not a phrase that I'm necessarily wanting to hear a ton more of. But maybe you do something with it with Lotus Fields. Maybe you're not doing something with Nykthos. Especially like in Explorer, where we don't have great ways like Hidden Strings or Pour Over pages. Okay. Ooh, Throne and Breaker of Silence. So 3 green. The spell can't be countered, and then has Trample as a 5/5. Throne and Breaker of Silence can't be the target of non-green spells that your opponent controls, or abilities from non-green sources your opponent controls. And then as long as it's your turn, Throne is indestructible. And unfortunately, that's kind of where it falls down. So, can't be countered, great. Trample, great. Can't be targeted by a bunch of stuff, great. But then is still vulnerable to all the types of wraths that we've seen. Whereas before you could like regenerate him, but that what's a regenerate? Nobody knows. Ancient history. Throne's pretty interesting though. Like uncounterable threats can be very, very powerful. We've seen like Carnage Tyrant, that kind of thing. I would keep my eye on it. I've said that phrase like I don't know why I'm saying that. Anyway, Tyrannax Rex. 4 green. Speaking of Carnage Tyrant, this spell can't be countered. It's an 8/8, so much bigger. Trample, Ward 4, and Haste, Toxic 4. And so spread some poison counters around as well. And it doesn't matter how much damage it deals, it's always to deal that Toxic 4 damage. So it means it's going to kill your opponent very, very quickly. It's 3 hits, whether they block it with whether they find some chump blockers or not. Even if they have like reasonable chump blockers, as long as it's doing 1 damage, it's going to do Toxic 4. And the key thing I want to draw attention to is the Ward 4 ability. Obviously pretty good anyway, but the problem with this kind of effect, without like having hexproof, is that normally you get like Wandering Emperor nowadays. But Ward 4 generally plays around that decent amount. You get to, they need 8 mana, and so, hey. Despite it costing 4 green, I think Tyrannax Rex is pretty interesting. It's hard to say, because the green deck right now, like the mono green ramp deck is just so kind of fixed as it is like its Karn toolbox, and then you have a couple of flex slots. It's a card you normally sideboard into, and there's not really space for Tyrannax Rex. But if things change a little bit, like maybe, I don't know, suddenly Karn ended up banned, then maybe it's got a slot. Venerated Rot Priest is one I want to talk about. Green for a 1/2, Toxic 1. Okay, so it's a 1 mana Toxic creature. But we already know Toxic 1, you're not going to be able to use your pump spells or whatever. Whenever a creature you control becomes a target of a spell, target opponent gets a poison counter. And note it says target of a spell, not of spell opponent controls or that you control. So it does both ends. And so I'm actually trying some of these out in Modern. We'll see if they're any good there. That's a different conversation. But if there's going to be some kind of creature-based Toxic poison deck, then I think Venerated Rot Priest will be the center of it. You have a bunch of ways to kind of protect it with targeting it. And so, hey, we'll keep an eye out. Atraxa Grand Unifier into Multicolor here. 3 green, white, blue, black. Legendary creature, Phyrexian Angel. When it tracks, it enters the battlefield with the top 10 cards of your library, then for each card type, you can put a card type from that type among the reveal cards into your hand. It's like Niv Paragon. It's a massive card advantage engine, but it has like flying, vigilance, death touch, lifelink, so it sticks around. It's gonna like also just like kill your opponent or stabilize the board for you because it's got that lifelink ability. It is, of course, significantly more expensive, but if you can ramp into it or find a way to get into play, because it is an enter the battlefield ability, it doesn't matter if you cast it or not, then whew, Atraxa is a sweet one to mess around with. Kaito, Dancing Shadow, 2 blue-black for a Planeswalker. It comes in on 3. Whenever one or more creatures you control do combat damage to a player, you may return one of them to its owner's hand. And if you do, you may activate low abilities of Kaito twice this turn rather than only once. If only there were creatures that you wanted to like reuse their into the battlefield effects for. Would be a shame, really. +1 up to 1 target creature can't attack or block till your next turn. 0, draw a card, and then -2, create a 2/2 colorless drone artifact creature token with death touch, and when this creature leaves the battlefield, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. This is a bit narrow, admittedly. Because this says whenever, it means that the Kaito needs to be in play already. You can't like attack with a creature and then post-combat play the Kaito and activate it twice. But hey, there's some potential going on here. There's some sneaky stuff. Kaya, Intangible Slayer, 3 white, black, legendary planeswalker, comes in on 6 loyalty and has hexproof by default, which is huge. If it enters the battlefield, it's going to stick around for a while. It's coming in on a huge loyalty already, and immediately has this +2, each opponent loses 3 life, you gain 3 life, and that obviously is like, hey, if you activate it 7 times, you just won the game, right? But there's a bunch of other stuff going on, and it can stabilize the board that way as well, and that way goes up to 8. You can pay 0, in which case you draw 2 cards, and then your opponent gets to scry 1, which is, you know, a downside, but you have this hexproof planeswalker, and a getting to net a bunch of cards, and then they have to commit resources to deal with it. And then -3, exile target creature or enchantment. If it wasn't an aura, create a token that's a copy of it, except it's a 1/1 spirit creature with flying and digital types. This has so much kind of like interesting words, vocabulary. It's got a lot of text on it that I want to investigate. Making copies of the creatures is pretty nuts, and so I'm curious to see how powerful this -3 ability is. Having practice is good. It's obviously 7 mana. It's super expensive. Everybody loves to try out like white-black control, white-black mid-range type stuff. I still have nightmares about getting out of Zendikar sometimes. And hey, it costs 7 mana. And it's not Ugin. But it is pretty cool. Malira the Living Cure. Green-white, legendary creature, human scout. It's a 3/3 already. If you would get 1 or more poison counters, instead you get 1 poison counter, and you can't get additional poison counters this turn. And then exile Malira the Living Cure, choose another target creature or artifact when it's put into a graveyard this turn, and return that card to your battlefield under its control. And so it has this Safi Eriksdottir-like ability, along with being a Watchwolf. I've seen some decks playing Fleecepaint Line recently in Pioneer, and I was like, oh, I kind of wish we had that in Explorer. I'd kind of like to mess around with that. It's not a super powerful effect, but it is really useful. Obviously, it's protection versus wrath and that kind of thing, as well as being an aggressive creature already. It's 2 mana legendary creature, which also has some other benefits to it, along with the downside of not being able to overload on them. But hey, pretty good. Nahiri the Unforging. We are Nahiri flooded at this point. 1 red, white, and then a red-white hybrid for Phyrexia mana. Cool to see. Completed. So if you play it for 3, it does come in on 3. +1 until the next turn, up to 1 target creature attacks a player each combat if able, so you can goad something. +1 discard a card, draw a card, kind of throwback to old Nahiri. But the 0 ability is where it gets interesting. 0, exile target artifact or equipment card with mana value less than Nahiri's loyalty from your graveyard. Create a token that's a copy of it. That token gains haste. Exile at the beginning of your next end step. So in Explorer, again, we don't have Sigarda's Aid. But in Pioneer, and then later on in Explorer in the year when we get Sigarda's Aid in Shadows of Innistrad Remastered, you can exile like a hammer from your graveyard, and then obviously the token enters the battlefield and you can equip it straight away. Or any other equipment. And so Nahiri the Unforging is pretty cool. One card that I didn't notice in the spoiler till quite late, in the preview. Tyvar, Jubilant Brawler, 1 black-green, comes in on 3 loyalty. You may activate abilities of creatures you control as those creatures have haste. We'll come back to that. +1 untap up to 1 target creature. -2 mill 3 cards, then you may return a creature card with mana value 2 or less from the graveyard to the battlefield. I like elves a lot. I've made maybe as many elves videos on the channel as I have any other archetype, and so obviously that's where Tyvar is like kind of at home naturally. And you have things like Circle of the Dreams Druid, which are normally just terribly inefficient. They cost, it's green, It's a tiny creature, and it will immediately get bolted. You're never going to activate it. Except that what if you got to play your elves out and then you just got to activate those abilities and get all the mana and then do all the things. All of a sudden, you're kind of off to the races. Add that with the ability to untap it, or like you reuse your Atlanta War Elf type elves, and then the ability to, when you get wrathed or when you get kind of swept, be able to just bring that creature from your graveyard. Oh, Tyvar is a sideboard card that elves is going to love. Absolutely love. And you can try playing it in the main deck as well, but that's where I kind of think it's at its best. Venser Corpse Puppet. Blue-black for a 1/3. Lifelink Toxic 1. Already pretty interesting. Again, zombie and wizard, as well as being legendary. So some pretty relevant stuff here. If you don't... Whenever you proliferate, though, choose one. If you don't control a creature named the Hollow Sentinel, create the Hollow Sentinel, a legendary 3/3 colorless Phyrexian Golem artifact creature token. Target artifact creature you control gains flying and lifelink until end of turn. Hey, if you proliferate, you get a 3/3, and then if it dies, you can go get another one. Obviously, Venser's a 1/3, but if you're, again, in that kind of like proliferate mid-range, like blue-black deck, which I'm theory crafting in my head, then, hey, we're in the business. And speaking of that as well, we have Voidwing Hybrid. Blue-black for a 2/1, and normally you see these effects as 1/1, so the 2/1 ability, as well as being toxic, I guess, does mean it gets quite aggressive, and it has the ability to be quite aggressive. Whenever you proliferate, return it from your graveyard to your hand. You get to recycle them. Okay, again, there's a bunch of good 2-drops. One thing worth noticing is if you like discard it to something like Ledger Shredder, then you can go get it back later. Kind of neat, kind of neat. Icoplex Golem. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield you control, if it has one or more oil counters on it, put an oil counter on it. Hey, we're going off with oil. And creatures you control the oil counters, Golem get +1/+1. It's a 2/3 to start off with, which is a bit weak in terms of power and toughness. It's quite vulnerable. But hey, if there's enough going on, there's enough going on. Maybe there's enough support for this kind of thing. Mirren Safe House. Oh, this card is wild. 3 mana artifact. As long as it's on the battlefield, it has all activated abilities of all land cards in all graveyards. It's not necessarily the like all-star in Pioneer and Explorer, but there is the potential for some nut stuff with it. There's a bunch of lands with good activated abilities, and hey, sometimes dumping them in the graveyard is easy to get into play, or you can dump them in the graveyard en masse, and this being able to reuse everything ability, whether you need whatever, is pretty cool. Pretty cool. Soulless Jailer. 2 mana 0/4, permanent cards in graveyards can't enter the battlefield. Players can't cast non-creature spells from graveyard or exile. It's an eat-hate card. I'm not sure if it'll make it into tons of sideboards, but hey. Staff of Completion. Oh, yeah. Everybody loves a Khan card. And hey, this one's doing not necessarily the most powerful stuff. But hey, there's a lot of text on it, it's got a lot of modes, and so you can never count it out. 3 mana to play, and then tap, and then pay life instead of mana is actually super powerful, in theory. Destroy target permanent you own. Okay, not that powerful. Add 1 mana of any colour. Okay, and a pricey mana rock. Tap, pay 3 life, proliferate. Ooh, and now we've got a bunch of... And we're talking about like tutoring for a Khan already. We're going to do some Planeswalker stuff. We're in green, having a good time. Pay 4 life, draw a card. You can get pretty greedy here, but also your life total is a resource. And then you can pay 5 mana to untap it. I don't know if it makes the cut across, and that's just really a testament to how many good cards there are to go and fetch with Khan already. But here. Oh, I wanted to throw a shout out here to Sword of Fortune Frontier. 3 to play, 2 to equip. Protection from red and green, which is interesting. Protection for green's definitely super relevant right now. Whenever a creature deals combat damage to a player, exile the top 2 cards to your library. You may play those cards this turn, and then you may play an additional land this turn. Pretty nice combination, the being able to exile the top 2 cards and then also be able to play an additional land if you hit one. Or hey, maybe you just have one in hand. I'm not like super excited about this card, but having like a way to tutor for pro green is actually kind of nice when Cavalier of Thorns gives the green deck a ton of like reach blockers. And so, hey, it's got some nice upside on it. We take those sometimes. Tablet of Completion. 2 mana artifact. Tap, put an oil counter on it. Tap at colorless. Only if it's got 2 or more oil counters on. So you've got to activate it a couple of times before you do that. So you can play it on turn 2 and then tap it, and then on turn 3 you have to tap it again, and on turn 4 you can activate it for mana. So it is pretty slow in that regard. However, you give this 1 tap, draw a card ability if it's got 5 or more oil counters on it. And sometimes you just want a permanent to put in play, and then eventually you'll get this payoff and be able to go off and do a bunch of things. I talked a little bit about Colorless Ramp already, but hey, it's a bit of an innocuous card that does say tap, draw a card on it later on. or as like an okay mana rock. I wanted to include one of the spheres here. So I went with the red one because that's the one that comes up first in alphabetical order. Sphere, land type, enter the battlefield tapped, so like, hey, you don't want to play a ton of these, you can't really afford to play a ton of these. There are some things that do things with spheres, but 1 red, tap, sacrifice it, draw a card, is cheap for this like ability to activate it. The red one's probably the one that's like the least likely to see you play. I literally just picked it because it's alphabetical order. Pioneer and Explorer, because we don't have them yet in either. And then next up we've got Phyrexia, which is another sphere land, taps for colorless, or taps to add 1 mana of any color if it enters the battlefield. So it's an interesting land in that regard. Like, hey, okay, the time you play it, it's like it's a Lotus land. I don't know what I call it. And then 3 tap, create a colorless 1/1 Phyrexian Might with Toxic 1, and this creature can't block. And this is super interesting. So like 3 tap means it's like 4 mana total to activate your ability, which is the land abilities that like do relevant things to the board. Not that much. It's like fairly reasonably priced. You can easily do this. This is also not just sorcery speed. You can just make the card tokens on end step. And obviously they do also have Toxic. They can't block, which is a massive downside. But out of something less controlling that's looking to make the tokens end the game, even out of a control deck because it's quote unquote free, though there are a bunch of utility lands. It's just a nice tool to have in the format, I think. The Monumental Facade. I think that's right. Another sphere land enters the battlefield with 2 oil counters on it. So we have a land that gets oil counters when it ETBs. A few different ways to use these oil counters. Again, we've seen some of them and talked about some of them over the course of the video. Remove an oil counter from it. Tap, remove an oil counter from it. Put an oil counter on target artifact or creature you control. Activate only as a sorcery. You can move it around. There's not a mana cost attached to this, other than the fact that you're using your land to do it. So effectively, it's costing you a mana, basically. But there are enough things with oil counters that, hey, we could be onto something. And notably, it's also not legendary, which sometimes if you have like lands that do this kind of thing, they are. Couple more cards here. The Mycosynth Gardens. Another sphere land, taps for colorless, or has that Chimera Grotto ability to filter for 1 mana of any color. Alternatively, X-tap the Mycosynth Gardens becomes a copy of target non-token artifact you control with mana value X. One huge thing to note here is that obviously it will be tapped. Because it taps to use the ability, so that's some limitations. But maybe we've got some pretty cool artifacts to copy. This is one we're going to have to think about. We're not copying mana rocks. Most of the creatures we're not going to want to copy either, but maybe there's something about here. Maybe there's something about. It's a tricky card, And then lastly, we have the Seed Core. The last sphere land taps to add colorless, and then taps to add 1 mana of any color, only for Phyrexian spells, no life cost attached on that. But then has corrupted, tap target 1/1 creature gets +2/+1 until turn, activate only if opponent has 3 or more poison counters. And what are 1/1s? All these toxic creatures that we're creating off our tokens. And so, hey, that's kind of neat. Obviously, that +2/+1 doesn't add to the toxic value, but it's an interesting card. It's like a fun take on like Pendle Haven type thing. So hey, and that's what we're leading things out with. I'm so excited to get my hands on the cards to play, both in paper and on Arena. I've got some Pioneer events and some Modern events I'm actually going to be trying some of these out in, along with all the Explorer content that I normally do. And so the set comes out, I believe, on the 7th, and I will be immediately opening a bunch of stuff and playing some games. So look forward to a bunch of videos. And if you are interested in those videos, thank you for watching, and please do subscribe to the channel. Other than that, have a great day. Peace soup.